take a minute to welcome everyone to the first talk in the Toward Transformative Justice, a Community Roundtable Series on Race, Racism, and Policing series. I'm Jennifer Lackey, and I'm a professor in the philosophy department, and I'm also the director of the Northwestern Prison Education Program. The Northwestern Prison Education Program is a partnership between Northwestern, the Illinois Department of Corrections, and Oakton Community College to provide a high-quality, comprehensive liberal arts education to men and women who are incarcerated in Illinois. And NPEP is hosting this bi-monthly roundtable series throughout the summer, and it'll include presentations by professors, authors, activist groups, and other key experts contributing to current conversations on race, racism, and policing. This series seeks to provide members of our community with an inclusive space that bridges research and community activism. And so promoting conversation and action on the problems of racism and policing is of special importance to NPEP, given their disproportionate impact on the lives of our students and their families. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn things over now to Tara, who will introduce the speaker.
Hi, everyone. It is my great honor to introduce Professor Sheila Betty. Professor Betty is a clinical professor at the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law and the director of the Community Justice and Civil Rights Clinic, which provides students with the opportunities to work within social justice movements on strategies aimed at redressing over-policing and mass imprisonment. Professor Betty litigates civil rights claims on behalf of people who have endured police violence and abusive prison conditions. Her partnerships with affected communities and grassroots community groups on litigation and policy campaigns have closed notorious prisons and jails, increased community oversight of law enforcement, created alternatives to imprisonment, and improved access to public education and mental health services. Professor Betty also teaches classes on legal reasoning and the law of state violence through our very own Northwestern Prison Education Program. We are so thrilled that she could join us to kick off this roundtable, and we thank you all for being here for this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Tara and Jennifer. I'm so grateful for the chance to be here. And I'm so grateful to be in community with the Northwestern Prison Education Program. Teaching in the program is really one of the great privileges of my life. And I wish our Northwestern students who are in custody could be here and could be part of these discussions. My intro to NPEP was as a guest lecturer at Jennifer Lackey's class. And that class, we talked about policing in Chicago. And although I have been, doing work in and around prisons for 20 years, I remember leaving that class feeling so inspired and so affirmed in this idea that the solutions to all of these issues lie with the people who are most proximate and who bear the full weight of the injustices of the systems we're going to be talking about. So I just want to acknowledge some of my greatest teachers, which are members of our Northwestern community who are in custody right now. So as Tara explained, my work focuses on policing and prisons, and my work has taken that shape in large part, because these are the institutions that reflect white supremacy, the white supremacy that is really a fabric of our country in perhaps the most visible way. But they are, of course, not the only institutions that represent the fabric of white supremacy. But they are institutions that create very clear legal targets. And that's one of the reasons why my work and the work of the clinic has been so focused on prisons and policing. I bring that up because I think it's so important right now in this moment that we're at, this moment of history, that conversations around policing implicate and interrogate white supremacy in a much broader, much more global sense. And one of the reasons why the uprisings we've seen over the past few weeks leave me so hopeful is because I see these conversations around policing really being expanded about transforming so many of the ways that our state works to reinforce white supremacy, works to further white supremacy, and has created so many of the disparate outcomes that are really trademarks of our country and our country's history. So policing is an important part of this conversation. but it's one part. And I'm going to talk about how investments in policing have fueled disinvestments in Black and brown communities. And I'm also going to talk about what opportunities for transformation are currently before us. So we're here at this moment, we're having these conversations. We have these opportunities for real transformation because yet again, caught on video is a police officer murdering a Black man. And these shootings are far too common. They happen often to Black and brown men, women, and children. And what these individual murders really do is lay bare the systemic deficiencies that infect policing, that infect the institution of policing. I very much reject the notion and the framing of one bad apple. There are certainly good people who make their careers working in policing, but it's important that we stay focused on the systemic issues that are demonstrated every time we see a video. And police officers and policing itself for so long has been the concepts of violence and lawlessness and the lack of accountability have been trademarks of policing in this country. And so I'm going to talk some about the challenges of taking on, from a legal perspective, in a wholesale manner, the police department. I'm going to put that in the frame of the current political system, and particularly what happens when the federal government abdicates its responsibility to enforce the Constitution in relation to policing, and what the way forward looks like. What does it mean when we talk about abolition? What does it mean when we talk about defunding the police? And what are some concrete ways we could get there? So I want to start with just a little bit of history about policing in Chicago. There's been so many reports about policing in Chicago. I was on a working group for the Police Accountability Task Force that was developed by the city after the LaQuan McDonald video was released. And I'm going to talk about that in some detail in a bit. But what that process really demonstrated to me is the history of policing in Chicago is one where there has been a scandal, and there's been a report, there's been efforts at reform. Scandal, report, efforts at reform, over and over and over again. And I'll start us with the uprisings, riots, depending on what words you want to use, that occurred during the summer of 1919. And these incidents began when there was an effort to integrate the 32nd Street beach. And a young man, a young Black man, who went over to what was deemed the white side of the beach. What happened next is a matter of some debate of historians. Some people say that he was in the water, was stoned, died, drowned. Other people say he went out, was swimming too far, that's how he drowned. What we know is that he did drown, and that the reactions to that were a number of uprisings, a number of communities, both Black and white, that were engaged in acts of violence, and that the police were very much involved in this. So after these riots or uprisings, there was a governmental report. And the report looked at both what happened during these riots, what happened immediately before, and it made some recommendations. So I'm going to read just briefly some of the recommendations here. So we'll start off with reading some from the introduction. While devoting much effort to the study of the Chicago riot as presenting many phases of the race problem, the Commission has placed greater emphasis upon the study of the conditions of life of the Black group in this community and of the broader questions of race relations. So we have about 100 years ago, this commission recognizing that if we're looking at policing abuses, we sort of have to look deeper and look deeper at sort of the ways in which race manifests. The commission also noted that members of the Black community distrusted police officers, and that it was implied and stated by the state's attorney that police were grossly unfair in making arrests, and there were instances of actual police participation in the rioting as well as neglect of duty. So these were findings that we have 100 years ago. The report also noted that the riot was merely a symptom of serious and profound disorders lying beneath the surface of race relations in Chicago. This report goes on to make recommendations about things like housing, like education, and also make some recommendations about policing and improving police-community relationships. So much of this is going to sound, I imagine, very familiar to many of you who are tuning in. So we can then go to 1972, where the Metcalf Commission was established. Congressman Metcalf established a Blue Ribbon Commission to again take a look at the Chicago Police Department and to develop findings. And we have a retread of what was found in 1920. We find again that Black communities distrust the police, that there is systemic racism throughout the department, that the department engages in unlawful uses of force. One of the things that the Metcalf Commission found was that when police officers engage in a particularly brutal act of violence against a community member, they then often charge individuals with what they call the Holy Trinity, which is disorder, and that those three charges are often a signia of a cover-up of excessive force. And when I was working the phones over the past 2 weekends ago during the uprisings, the calls that were coming in of offenses that people were being charged with were disorderly and resisting. So that was in a report in 1972. We're seeing much of it the same today. And again, bearing out this sort of pattern of scandal, documentation, reform, which has happened throughout the history of the Chicago Police Department. So let's fast forward a bit to more recent history, to 2015. And that is when the world watched a Chicago police officer, Jason Van Dyke, murder Laquan McDonald. And that video and the video is horrifying. The video is horrifying because it depicts a police officer abuse his authority in such an obvious way. It's horrifying because other officers were on the scene, engaged in acts of cover-up. It's horrifying also because of how commonplace those types of use of forces are. And it's horrifying because we only know about Laquan McDonald's murder because of the fight to expose that video. It's horrifying because of how many Laquan McDonald's we don't know, right? How, if there was not that fight for transparency, Laquan McDonald would have been yet another young Black man murdered by the Chicago Police Department, and their narrative would have carried the day. Their narrative of Laquan McDonald being armed would have carried the day. After that video was released, once again, we saw mostly young, mostly Black organizers take to the streets and demand justice and demand a real change in policing in Chicago. And in direct response to those demands for justice, elected officials, both here and at the federal level, began to respond. And policing and police violence and the racism that's so endemic in policing became a political issue. Now, of course, there was a movement going on around the country, the movement for Black Lives, and this was a particular moment in history where elected officials were being forced to confront the realities of policing and the realities of race. One of the responses that happened was the federal government coming to Chicago and conducting a widespread investigation of the Chicago Police Department. the largest investigation of its kind. Now, of course, this is the Obama administration, and the purpose of the investigation was to document whatever issues existed with the Chicago Police Department, and then engage in, generally speaking, what happens in these processes, engage in negotiations with the city, engage in negotiations to determine what kind of reform efforts the city would agree to in order to address the issues with policing in Chicago. And those reform efforts are often reduced to writing in a document called a consent decree. So this is the process that's been used in Los Angeles, in Newark, in New Orleans, all over the country to bring some kind of transparency and accountability to police departments. And they've had varying degrees of success. But there was a real sense among people who had been working on policing in Chicago for generations that a Department of Justice consent decree, oversight brought by the federal court, could really be the thing that had been missing. I talked about 2 points in history about policing in Chicago, but there's so many more. There's the murder of Fred Hampton. There is the legacy of Chicago police detective John Burge, who systematically tortured Black and brown people into confessing often to crimes they didn't commit. There's people locked up right now today for behind confessions they gave through that torture. So the point is that there had been all of these moments, these sort of flashpoints. And one of the things that had not yet happened was a federal consent decree. So that felt like a very important moment. And some of the community groups that we work very closely with, including people who themselves had been brutalized by the Chicago Police Department, who lost their children to violence at the hands of Chicago police, engaged in this federal investigation, told their stories, shared their perspectives. And when we talk about that moment, now, it's clear that people really felt hopeful that this consent decree negotiated by the Department of Justice, this process was going to bring some real change. And I can remember doing a teach-in about this whole process and explaining to community members how this process has worked, how it's gone down in other jurisdictions. And I think this was in December 2000. It was before the election. And anyway, I was asked, what would happen through this consent decree if there's a Trump Justice Department? And my response was like, we have so many problems policing in Chicago. We shouldn't have talk about a Trump Justice Department. We don't have to worry about that, right? Have an uphill battle fighting with that Justice Department. Of course, then the election happened, and Jeff Sessions was Trump's appointee, and he made it very clear his hostility to consent decrees, his hostility to police. Everything changed in terms of our hopes of this one process to really, so we regrouped in terms of our legal strategy and in terms of trying to figure out what could be possible given the federal government's decision to completely abdicate its responsibility to secure these consent decrees. It's incredibly difficult because of a number of legal procedural barriers for private citizens, for people to get consent decrees over police departments. So we developed a legal strategy where we worked collaboratively with a number of community-based, the NAACP, Women's All Points Bulletin, Network 49, Brighton Park Neighborhood Council, to file a lawsuit seeking a consent decree. And seeking a consent decree that would be directly accountable to the communities that are most likely to be over-policed, that have experienced the full brunt of the history of Chicago's policing and of the investments, the continuing investments in policing at the expense of investing in communities. And Northwestern students were involved in this process at every stage, from meeting with family members who had lost children at the hands of CPD, to researching really complicated legal issues. And after a significant amount of struggle and lots of different legal posturings, we were able to get a consent decree. We were able to get a consent decree, and the organizations that we represent have the ability to both monitor that decree and enforce it in federal court. It's the only consent decree in the country that gives people directly affected by police violence that right. So we secured our goal in that consent decree. The goal was to set out to develop this legal strategy to make the consent decree real, to give communities most affected by police violence power in that process. So we're very proud of the consent decree, but the reality is many of you who I'm sure saw on social media or on the news what the police response is. Sorry, I'm just getting a note that my internet is unstable. I'm going to turn off my video for a minute and keep on going to see if we could get this stabilized. So we saw on social media and on the news that Chicago Police Department's response to people who were protesting demonstrates that the consent decree has some very limited ability to provide real protections on the street. Now, the news of the consent decree overall is actually quite good. From 2015 to 2019, there has been a 24% reduction in overall use of force. There's been a 47% reduction in the use of fatal force. This is all good news, right? This is all sort of the reason why we fought so hard for this strategy. But still, what we've seen over and over again with Chicago policing is this culture of policing with violence and with disregard for the constitutional rights of our communities. What we saw, what there were reports of, what I have been taking intake on ever since, are literally hundreds of stories and accounts of beatings and injuries and false arrests that resulted from the protests, from the uprisings that we saw recently. So how could this happen? I mean, how could we have this history, this legacy of abusive policing in Chicago, report after report documenting it? A federal consent decree, a city that's led by a mayor who ran her campaign on police accountability. So how could we end up here where we are now confronted with all of these videos and all of these reports of incredibly abusive police tactics? Well, I want to go back to where we started, and that is really the intractability of white supremacy. For over 100 years, the Chicago Police Department has had a race problem, a problem with violence, a problem with accountability, and reform after reform after reform has failed. But what hasn't happened, what's been missing from efforts to change the Chicago Police Department, is a concerted effort to shift power from the police to the community. In essence, to defund the police, which is a rallying cry that I know some of you have seen on social media and reported. And that is an idea that I'm sure sounds radical to so many of you, but it's something that is achievable, and it's something that police officers themselves often talk about. And I'm going to give now 4 examples of how this idea of defunding the police, shifting power from police to the communities, is something that is achievable. The first one is that police officers themselves often complain that they are required to just do too much. They come into communities and have to be mental health counselors, school attendance officers, they are marital counselors, and police officers will talk about the limited capacity they have to perform these functions. This is not what they're trained to do. This is not their line of work. Yet they are constantly burdened with the need to respond in those capacities. There are interventions that are desperately needed for people who live with mental illness, for people, young people, for families, for whatever reason, that are having a hard time accessing public education. So the answer here is to divert funding from the policing function into the kinds of resources that communities need to be safe and to be healthy, like mental health resources. Now, this is not something that would happen overnight. It would be a gradual process. It's a process that would recognize the resources that do exist in Black and Brown communities, in building those up. And it's a process that recognizes that we are dealing with limited funds when we're talking about government budgets, and that every penny that goes into the policing function is a penny that is not invested in our Black and Brown communities. There's examples of this working in Chicago. There is an organization called Mothers Against Senseless Killing, which is led by a Black woman from the South Side of Chicago. And that organization uses the strengths of its community connections to essentially occupy the block and to stop street violence. It's been incredibly effective. It's one example of a community-based approach to violence and a community-based alternative to policing. The second change that needs to happen in policing that would make this a different moment in history than those that we talked about is a recognition that arrests themselves are acts of violence, and limiting officers' ability to arrest people for minor offense. Arrests tear people away from their communities. In these days, an arrest can expose people to the coronavirus, to a lethal virus. For many people who end up arrested, it imposes on their families, on their communities, financial distress because of the money bond system. So limiting police officers' power to arrest people for minor offenses and providing police officers with incentives to solve problems without an arrest would go far to reduce the power of the police to inflict harm. And these are changes we've seen in police departments across the country. And the data demonstrates that when police departments implement these kinds of changes, when police departments affirmatively limit police officers' ability to arrest, that uses of force go down, and obviously people are then not exposed to the violence of an arrest. And in community members, it also has a reduction in crime rates overall when we are using our resources in a much more strategic way. The third change that has not been adopted in the Chicago Police Department over history is removing incentives for abusive policing. Right now, police officers actually have an incentive to engage in a use of force or to begin an arrest at the end of their shift, because what will happen then is that they will get overtime, be paid time and a half. So within the system of policing, there are a number of these incentives that are furthering the abuse of our community members. And these incentives have never been addressed in a holistic or systemic way. And then the final change is about ensuring community control of the police, ensuring that communities have the ability to control the policing function in their communities, just like happens with school boards in so many communities. So I'm going to end my remarks here, but before I do, I want to go back to the Northwestern Prison Education Program and the power of the program. And I know many of you likely know that the Northwestern One book is Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. And Brian is a hero of mine. He does really incredible work taking on these systems, calling out white supremacy. And one of the things that Brian talks about is the power of proximity, the importance of staying proximate to communities, the importance of staying proximate to those who bear the full weight of injustice, because they've got the answer to these intractable problems. And one of the incredible benefits of the Northwestern Prison Education Program is that it helps our entire communities stay proximate. And that relates back to the issue of Chicago policing, because why hasn't the Chicago police changed after all these years? The answer is because we've not yet imposed upon this system the solutions developed by those who are most proximate. And that's the opportunity that we have right now. We have the opportunity to change that, to implement the demands that have been made by those who are most proximate, so that 100 years from now, we're not talking about the report that's going to arise out of these uprisings as yet another missed opportunity. Historians should be able to look back at this moment and say it's the moment that everything changed, and it changed because we implemented the demands and the solutions developed by those who are most proximate. And that's what I see as the imperative of this moment right now. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Michaela Stokes, who will talk for a few moments about her perspectives and working on these issues in the clinic.
Thanks, Sheila. Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela Stokes, and I am a recent grad from Northwestern. I had the privilege of working under Sheila for the last year. So I'll just talk a little bit about my experiences as a Black woman in the clinic. I worked predominantly on the Chicago consent decree and with the coalitions and organizations involved in the Chicago consent decree. So again, I'll focus just on some of my reflections as a Black, soon-to-be baby lawyer, law student in the clinic, and what I think is helpful for everyone else who's not Black to know about working in these spaces and with these communities. So a couple of things that were interesting to me about the consent decree and the process was, again, we were working with a ton of predominantly Black community organizations, but we were working with the city and the AG as well as the independent monitor and her team. So what was really interesting was to see, for me to feel the difference in what it was like to work with the individual clients in the community groups. I worked a lot with particularly Black women who were leading these organizations and what that experience was like. So if I was working to say, either host or help host a community teach-in and they were leading it, what my role working with them looked like. And predominantly it was to amplify their needs and their wishes in any way possible and just almost be a communicator between these women and the other students in the clinic as well. And then what it would look like after going from that space that was such a, for me, organic environment and working with them in such an easy way, and then going into spaces where we will be meeting with the entire team and see how easily it would be to see Black voices in the community organizations perhaps be overrun, or just what the difference of navigating a Black lawyer, law student in that space compared to when you're working directly with the organizations when you're in a room and they're leading the conversations. So the importance of, I think what Sheila taught me and what I took away from the clinic was the importance of having these meetings before we're going into these spaces and reflecting after the meetings to say, oh, I kind of found this uncomfortable. And I'm not sure if somebody who's not coming from my lens as a Black woman would have recognized why this was uncomfortable or why I feel like somebody's experiences were undermined. I also really enjoyed working on a couple of other like observation projects with Sheila. So one that stuck out a lot to me was a deposition for Strawberry. And what was helpful about that for me was, again, seeing Sheila and other women of color leading those spaces. So I think for when we're talking about proximity, those were really helpful for me. And then it made me be able to go back to our clients and continue facilitating what I saw and make them feel comfortable sharing their lived experiences, which are still different than mine as a Black woman who's privileged in going to Northwestern Law School, and just creating the channel of communications that's so important when we're talking about trying to uplift the voices of the Black community and the Black organizers that have been doing this work for so long. But that's really all I have to add, unless Sheila, you have any more specific questions or wanted me to hit on anything different.
Michaela, I think that was perfect. And I would love for Mariah and then Tara just to talk briefly about their experiences.
Sure. So my name is Mariah Young. I'm a rising third-year student at Northwestern, and I was in Sheila's clinic this past semester and then continuing through the summer and into the fall. I had the privilege of working with the NAACP in Chicago on some policy work, which was really interesting and opened my eyes. I'm not from Chicago, so it opened my eyes a lot more than I already knew about the police department in Chicago. But working with them was a great experience for multiple reasons. It was great as a Black woman to get to work with an organization that directly is aiming to benefit and advance other Black people, especially within the Chicago community. And secondly, it was really interesting working with them because we didn't go in with a specific goal in mind. It was kind of like, here are things that the organization wanted to know. And so for me, and the other student who was working on the project for me, we were kind of following their lead in what they wanted. And so we would research questions they had about either the Chicago Police Department's union contract or the state law that allowed Illinois police officers to get an extra protection of rights when there's an investigation into them. But we really didn't have a solidified plan, which at first was a little bit of a struggle as like a very type A law student to kind of get used to. But what I learned from Sheila and from just working with that organization is that as lawyers who are going to a community of people that we don't necessarily identify with, a really important thing is to kind of take a step back and let them lead the way and just be of service to them, rather than what I think a lot of traditional either clinic approaches or just like law firm pro bono approaches are, which is kind of like go in, fix the problem, and then leave. In this instance, our goal was kind of to go in and support them however they needed help and kind of serve as like a general counsel to the people who are working on this reform and allow them to ask questions where they had questions and then give us more work where they needed work. And I think that is really important as we kind of move through this uprising and continue to do the work, especially for people who don't necessarily identify with the community that they're working with and that they're white or they just aren't familiar with necessarily the Black community in Chicago. And I think that kind of summarizes a lot of my experience in the clinic and a lot of the work that I've gotten to do in Chicago since I've been here. I don't know if there's anything else that, Sheila, you wanted me to touch on, but that was kind of everything that I had.
That was great, Mariah. And Tara, could you talk a little bit about your work with CPAC and what community control of the police actually means?
Sure. So CPAC stands for the Civilian Police Accountability Council, and it was proposed by a coalition of community groups. And the ordinance to create CPAC is currently sitting in the Public Safety Committee of the Chicago City Council. So CPAC would be amazing. It would create, some real civilian oversight of policing. The council would be composed of folks who are directly elected, who are not allowed to be former law enforcement officers, who have experience being involved with the community. And CPAC would have final authority over CPD policies. They'd be able to hire and fire the CPD superintendent. And so this is like the community control that Sheila was talking about that we really need. And, she talked about the long history of police brutality in Chicago. There's also been a lot of different oversight mechanisms. There was the Office of Professional Standards, and then in 2007, the Independent Police Review Authority, and then there was just more corruption, more brutality. And she talked about the Laquan McDonald case, which led to the creation of our current COPA, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. And these just have all made really clear that the city is incapable of addressing police misconduct and police terror on its own. So CPAC is awesome. 19 elder people have already signed on to it, which means they only need 7 more. So we're gonna send some resources at the end. But one thing you could do if you live in Chicago is look up who your elder person is and whether or not they've signed on to CPAC, and there are a lot of resources online for you to call or email them. And just in the clinic, we've done a little bit of advocacy work around CPAC. I don't know, Sheila, is there anything else you want to say about CPAC?
I think that's great. And I think that for folks, I see at least one question in the chat about what people can do. And I think that that's an important concrete step that people can do is get active in the campaign for CPAC. So thank you, Tara.
Thanks.
Great, thanks, Sheila. So thanks so much for the presentation. And if you'd like to conclude here, then we can move on to Q&A. Does that work for you?
That's perfect.
Okay, great. So I have a queue here going. So if you have any questions, just as a reminder, make sure to type those into the chat. And if you want it to be anonymous, send it to Charlotte Rosen via direct message. So the first question here says, how does defunding the police interact with the police union? Specifically, if police departments shrink, who and how will make the decisions as to which officers stay on? We know the police unions are one of the most important obstacles to the type of changes you mentioned. Can you share your thoughts about how to organize against the union's opposition?
Yeah, two really great questions. I'll take the easier question first, and that is the police union contract. And one of the things that was really incredible and really precedent setting around the investigation the Department of Justice did into policing in Chicago is that it actually made findings that the police contract is one of many, but one of the things that fuels unconstitutional policing. And that's because of the ways in which the contract creates mechanisms that allow police officers to cover up their wrongdoing and actually prohibits discipline of officers who engage in that cover-up. So that's an incredibly important fact about the contract as it currently operates. And immediately after the Laquan McDonald video was released, City Council held some oversight hearings where people came and testified. And the reality of these contract terms became public and people started talking about them. And during one of these hearings, a City Council member actually asked the then president of the police union about these terms, about why the contract included these terms. And he responded that when City Council approved the contract, everybody gave him a standing ovation. And that it was only now that the Laquan McDonald video was released and that they were getting negative press, was he getting questions about the terms of this contract. And, you know, I agreed with him. I think that that was the exact right response, because the reality is City Council has been complicit in much of this. City Council has the ability to, or has the obligation to sign off on the police contract and has to approve it, and has not provided the kind of oversight to these negotiations that are necessary to ensure that the police contract does not further abuse of policing. The contract's currently in negotiations right now. And the contract is under the consent decree. The contract has to reflect some of the changes in policing about use of force, about training, about accountability, but we don't yet have a contract. And one of the things that people who are particularly concerned of that issue can focus on is engagement with their City Council members, because that is something that will come to City Council. We'll be hearing about it once it does, and ensuring that your council member does not vote for a contract that isn't significantly overhauled. And then in terms of what would it mean for the union if the Chicago Police Department was essentially defunded? Yeah, I think it's important to take this step by step. And the reality is, when we're talking about defunding the police, we're not talking about eradicating the existence of the Chicago Police Department tomorrow. What we are talking about is a gradual process that will divert resources from the police department and will take concrete steps to mitigate and in some ways end the harm that CPD can impose on communities. So those are, if we take those steps, we won't get to the question of what is it going to mean for labor rights for quite a while. I do think that those are important questions that are being currently raised and debated amongst the people who are working on these issues. So did I get both of the union related questions, the contract related questions? Okay.
I think so, Sheila. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so the next question reads, can you talk more about the actions specifically in Minneapolis? What is your perspective on why the organizers were able to secure such a victory? What are the important next steps to make the victory last?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing I'm constantly in awe of about with the organizers that I'm lucky enough to collaborate with is sort of their brilliance in their strategy and how they push, those of us who are lawyers and who often have limited imagination to really imagine, a different world. And I think staying focused on really bold demands is one of the things that created some of the groundwork there. The movement for Black Lives has been talking about defunding the police since its inception. So while this is a demand that may only now be getting traction publicly or sort of in the widespread way, the reality is it's something where there have been strategies laid to make these demands and to get us there for a very long time. I think that it was because of the sort of strategy and the cohesion of these demands. I also think that the movement is still trying to figure out what is this going to mean specifically? Like, what is it going to mean in Minneapolis to defund the police? And there is going to still be a state system of public safety. So disbanding and what that means is going to happen jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So I think it's both the rigor of the organizers, and I also think it is now incumbent upon the people who've been working there to ensure that whatever disbanding means is something real and isn't a soundbite. And I know folks are very focused on that right now.
Great, thanks, Sheila. The next question says, people are saying there would still be a limited subset of people that are responsible for violent crimes. Would they be called police? Where would they be placed? And what would this job look like?
So when we're talking about the ideals of abolition, it is both about taking power away from these structures, both policing and imprisonment, building up some of the alternatives that I talked about before, healthy communities, but also recognizing that people will harm each other, that is sort of an inevitability of human existence. It's something that does happen, and that there need to be interventions that both ensure that people are held accountable for the harm that they cause, and also to ensure that harm stops, that harm ends. There's a number of approaches to that, both restorative justice, transformative justice, and then there also is an acknowledgement that there will be some people who will have to be removed from their communities. There will be some people who, for a variety of reasons, may not be able to live safely in community. But what does it mean to remove folks, right? And what rights do they have? And how are they able to still remain connected and to self-actualize? And those answers, the answers to those questions, I think mean a system that is very different from any prison, certainly that exists in the US and likely across the world as well. So the first question when we're talking about abolition is sort of what do we need to be safe and healthy as a community? And then the questions are, how do we intervene, and to what extent do we want the state to intervene when the inevitable harm occurs between people?
Thanks, Sheila. The next question reads, in explaining the problems, in explaining the problems and possible solutions, how might we engage the people who are basically, quote, crime junkies? White people who spend most of their time following and publicizing the often minor offenses committed by people of color in an attempt to other the entire POC community. How will we explain the concept of defunding the police to these kinds of people?
That's a great question. You know, one of the things that we have as a result of the explosion of both policing and mass imprisonment is a lot of data around what works and what doesn't work. And we know that imprisonment alone doesn't work to make us safer. As a matter of fact, the data is very compelling, and it demonstrates that imprisonment has a negative public safety outcomes, in part because of the opportunity costs of imprisonment, and in part because of the realities of imprisonment and what it means for most people who are imprisoned and have to live in the brutal environment that prison is and then come home. Often most people aren't able to come home after going through a program like NPEP. So there's really compelling data about how what we're currently doing in the realm of public safety when it comes to imprisonment just doesn't work. The same is true in policing. There is some data that suggests there's some deterrent value in policing, but the reality is there's not data that suggests that you hire more police, put them on the street, you get a reduction in crime. You know, the opposite really is. We've got data that talks about positive public safety investments result in reductions of crime. And one of the reasons for this is because police officers really have, as we've currently constructed policing, really have one tool, and that is an arrest. That is the thing that police officers do. It's a reactive public safety function. It's not preventative. And because of the issues with arrest, the number of false arrests, the adverse consequences of just simply an arrest, the public safety benefit of policing overall is one that's more about myth than about data. So the data out there about what works to keep us safe is very compelling if that's sort of what someone's focus is truly on.
Thanks, Sheila. The next question we have here is, what should we expect from our federal officials in the context of a really important election year? How can we expect our federal officials to amplify the message of the lead organizers, or what do we do when they fail to do so?
So I think one is ensuring that the U.S. Department of Justice will fully be using its power to provide oversight for unconstitutional policing, and will ensure that these consent decrees that have existed with the federal government and local jurisdictions around the country will be real, will be enforced, but also will not be used to sort of reinvest in the policing function. We are really at a moment right now where because I think of the pandemic and so many other things that even prior to the uprisings made clear the realities of race in this country in a way that hasn't been on the front page of newspapers for a very long time. And because of that, it's important that the federal government does not use sort of the power of the purse, the power of its ability to regulate, to be talking about ways in which policing can, as an institution, can be fixed. There's important harm reduction that the federal government can do. There's important harm reduction that the government must do, but also must be looking at ways for local governments to reinvest in Black and Brown communities. And there are a number of different ways that can happen by providing incentives for the jurisdictions that actually do that. Just like there's been federal incentives for jurisdictions that engage in certain types of policing, really looking at those kinds of initiatives and ensuring that they are about reallocating local funding instead of just strengthening the policing function.
Thanks, Sheila. And for everybody typing your questions, we still have time, so feel free to keep them coming. We have a lot of questions too. So the next question here says, would defunding the police cause unemployment for current police officers? How will we reintegrate police officers into the workforce society? And I'm combining this with another question that says, I was wondering, since we allow for privatized prisons, how does that affect an incentive for incarcerations made by the police? Is it possible to change one system without the other?
Yeah, good questions. I can talk a little bit about the employment issues in the context of some prison work that I've done, where we've tried to shut down prisons in the Deep South, where we have shut down prisons in the Deep South, where there isn't the right to work states. We don't have the same kind of union protections, but we definitely had to deal with these same issues of what would this mean for unemployment, particularly in small prison towns where the prison was the employment, was sort of the economic driver. And the answer to that question was to find ways to redeploy people who could be redeployed, and taking that on affirmatively as part of the plan. And this was a controversial thing for the folks that we were working with and for many of the organizers, because a lot of the people who worked in the prisons were quite abusive, and being able to kind of talk about the economic realities of closing down a prison and acknowledging that that people, even people who do bad things and who engage in this kind of abuse, have families to support and are contributing economically to their communities. So there's the possibility of taking similar strategies in terms of redeploying people who can be redeployed. One of the things that we did recognize in the context of that campaign in particular was that there were going to be some people who couldn't be redeployed to do some kind of like community-based supervision. There were going to be people who just weren't able to do that, in part because of the long record of abuse and abuse within community. So there are processes for redeployment, but also it is going to be, there will be police officers who end up without jobs, right? Ultimately, if we're successful. But I want to again stress that this is not an overnight thing. This is a thing that is going to happen in a very systemic way. And in a way that ensures that we're building up what is necessary to replace the current public safety apparatus, but before we're actually eliminating in a major way the policing function.
Thanks, Sheila. The next question here says, do you have any guidelines for discerning which proposed changes or reforms are likely to be ineffective or increase police power versus those that further the goals of abolition?
Yeah, there is a great sort of cheat sheet on this that's put out by, I believe, Critical Resistance, that we could send out, that sort of helps people identify reformist reforms as opposed to reforms that are really that are about diverting power, taking power away from the police, or diverting power to communities. And some of the really popular reformist reforms are things like body cams, or things like increased training, some changes in policy. So it looks like that was just put up, the reformist reforms cheat sheet. So I think those are really important questions to be asked, especially now, when there's this conflux of factors, including the economic crisis that's been brought on by the pandemic, that all levels of government are going to be struggling with, looking ways to save money, looking at ways to ensure that people who are in great economic distress are having their needs met. So it's an important time to reallocate the way we spend our tax dollars, and to recognize that policing abuse happens, in our name, with our tax dollars. And how can we make different allocations that are more in line with some of the values of fair policing, without falling into investing in some of these reforms that the data shows just don't work.
Thanks, Sheila. Next question here says, you talked about other roles or functions that police assume on the day-to-day that would be more fit for nurses and mental health professionals. Are there any ideas on what it could look like to have first responders for mental health that are part of the public safety programs? Do they already exist on some level?
Yeah, there are a number of programs across the country called crisis intervention teams, or different iterations of that, where when a police officer or police force is called in on a mental health crisis, they lead with trained mental health professionals. And that the goal is around de-escalating. This is a model that has really been pioneered in Memphis. There's a lot of literature out there about the way that's worked. Often people are there with sort of a police backup. Mental health professionals are there with a police backup. But it's been incredibly successful, both in reducing uses of force against people who live with mental illness, as well as reducing arrests. And it's sort of recognizing that that the police function is not equipped to deal with a public health crisis, either on an individual level or a systemic level. That again, the tools that police have are really reactive, and they're not about trying to solve some of these both either kind of clinically significant issues or systemic issues.
Thanks, Sheila. The next question says, speaking as a social scientist, the person asking the question, what sorts of evidence about police behavior are we most lacking that would be influential in legal proceeding toward advancing some of the policy goals you have talked about?
It's a great question. You know, some data, I think, about some of the near misses. One of the big fights that we've had in the consent decree context is about police officers pointing their guns at people and whether or not that's a use of force, whether or not that should be tracked as a use of force. And what the literature suggests is that it should, that it's an incredibly traumatic thing that happens to an individual when a police officer points their gun. And that also it may indicate something about police behavior. Police who are more likely to take their gun out and point it, even if they're not shooting, may be more inclined to use force in ways that could be problematic. So we have data around things like actual uses of lethal force. But I think digging into some of the near misses, it would be incredibly important. The other literature out there, or the other literature that I feel like we're beginning to see, but haven't fully explored, are the public health consequences of abusive policing. You know, what does it mean? What are the long-term mental health consequences for communities that have been so over-policed, and for communities that haven't necessarily had to live through kind of a high-profile police killing, but are having to endure the kind of more pedestrian, but still horrific and unconstitutional occupations and sort of daily harassments by police officers. What does that do to our communities? What does that do to people's mental health, to their sense of sort of physical safety? And really digging into the adverse public health consequences of our current policing function, even for people who might not get arrested or might not be bruised or beaten, I think is research that's lacking from the field right now.
Great. Next question is, Sheila, you mentioned that policing and prisons are two of the best legal targets to fight white supremacy. Could you explain the legal obstacles to fighting white supremacy in other areas of social life, like education, housing, access to food, healthcare, etc.?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why we've got legal tools at our disposal in the prison context, in the policing context, is because we've got constitutional amendments where we can make arguments. We can make arguments that prisons violate the cruel and unusual punishment clause of the Constitution. We've got arguments that the Fourth Amendment prohibits that prohibits violence. The Equal Protection Clause prohibits racial discrimination in policing. So we've got these claims that we can make. And we have a right to be free of state violence, specifically in those contexts through our Constitution. We don't have a right to food. In most states, we don't have a right to education under our Constitution. The only people who have a right to medical care a federal constitutional right to medical care are people who are in prison or in jail. So really it's about the limits of the US law, the limits of the Constitution, particularly when compared to the requirements of international human rights law, that our system just doesn't provide us with the legal tools to affirmatively seek things like equal access to food in all of our communities, equal access to healthcare. So part of it is just the way our legal system is structured, and part of it is really, I think, crystallized when you do some comparisons between US law and our requirements in international human rights law.
Thanks, Sheila. So we have time for a couple more questions. So I'll read 2 more here. So the next one says, can you tell us something about the militarization of the police in terms of training, rules of engagement, and their effect on police mentalities?
Yeah, so there's been concerted efforts by the federal government to sell surplus equipment to local police forces. And we really first began to see that publicly during the Ferguson uprisings. And it's both about equipment, and then it is also about training. So it's about the use of things like riot gear. What does that do just to the psychology of the police officers when they are sort of suiting up, coming out ready to either engage in a riot or beat back people who are protesting? And it's also about how it also, I think, signifies a lot about how police departments are interacting with communities. You know, I think I used the term before as an occupying force, and that's often what we've seen, particularly in departments that are getting this federal equipment. One of the things that the Department of Justice report talked about was training and culture, where police officers are sort of lifted up as warriors that are kind of going into hostile territory, as opposed to guardians, right? And this idea that you have a police department that is sort of putting itself forward as a warrior, you know, kind of going in, using this equipment, declaring victory, as opposed to a police department that sees itself as the guardians of these communities and people who are there to keep everyone safe. So I think that that's sort of the juxtaposition that really explains why militarization is such a problem, and why it has no place in policing.
Great. Next question says, do current proposals for defunding the police include plans to discontinue juvenile detention centers and the sentencing of minors as adults? What can be done to make sure that defunding plans include getting rid of these systems?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the vision for abolition, and I'm going to use that term as shorthand, is really about transforming all aspects of our current public safety system. So it's about diverting resources from the police, in part to reduce the need for things like the juvenile detention system, like the Cook County Jail, like our prison system. And it's about recognizing the ways in which the systems have failed to meet the needs of both our communities generally, and then populations with special needs particularly. And I think that's demonstrated when we look at the way the system treats young people, teenagers, the way it treats women, people with disabilities. So these are all part of the ultimate plan, and which should be kind of the consequences of a plan that really diverts resources from our current public safety apparatus into our communities. And then in terms of the laws, you know, the procedural statutes in Illinois that allow the transfer of children into the adult system, many of those, almost all of those throughout the country, were developed in the late 80s when there was this fear of super predators. And that was research put out by a criminologist who has disavowed it now and has recognized the harm it's done. And those laws were done, were done by our elected officials, again, done in our name in an effort to keep us safe. They've had the complete opposite effect. We have a lot of, again, really strong data about the ways in which laws that put children into the adult system are counterproductive and simply don't work to keep any of us safe and create really negative outcomes for those children.
Thanks, Sheila. And so we have a final question, which is action-oriented. And just so everybody knows, we'll be sharing in the chat below to your right a list of action items and resources that you can look to in case you want to get involved in some of these campaigns. The question is, what arguments have you found to be the most persuasive to advocate for the abolishment, defunding of the police, especially for people who are not knowledgeable about these issues? What resources would you recommend to folks who are willing to consider defunding or abolishing police but are not there yet? Books, articles, etc., or anything else?
I'm happy to send out some books and some articles and to see what resources are up there, and to see how I could supplement. And then I think just in terms of talking about it and sort of ensuring how we advocate for this outcome. One, we focus on the data and we focus on what creates healthy communities, what creates safe communities. It's not investments in police. We've got the data to back that up. We know that it is investments in public health infrastructure, in education, in economic development. We've got reams of data that demonstrate that is in fact the case. People will often say, well, what about the murderers, right? What about the people who are committing really serious acts of interpersonal harm? And I think we have to acknowledge that exists, that is a real thing, but that the police are not keeping us safe. That is not, the police are this reactive force. And that meeting communities' needs are an incredibly important way to get at some of the issues that drive interpersonal violence. And that the idea of defunding the police is not about a lack of accountability for people who harm. It's about ending a form of state violence, and it's about reallocating our resources to build up communities that have been so historically disinvested. So I think it's about talking about what keeps us safe, the long legacy of the public safety, police and prisons being a tool of social control, a tool of white supremacy, and then also demonstrating how many communities we have in this country that are predominantly white that are essentially not policed, right? That are essentially keep themselves safe. And because we know how to have safe communities that are not over policed, they exist all over this country. Why don't our Black and brown communities deserve the same thing?
Okay, well, I think that's going to wrap up the Q&A. So we will, this ends at least a part of the program, so we can all thank Sheila and her students, Mariah, Michaela, and Tara, for this wonderful presentation. We're going to allocate about 10 minutes to breakout sessions. For those who, it's an optional part of the program. If you would like to join one of the breakout sessions, we will have a facilitator in every breakout session, so you don't have to talk if you don't want to, and if you want to just come and be a part. We just wanted to create some space for people to talk about these issues in a more intimate setting. So thanks again to Sheila and to Michaela, Mariah, and Tara, and to all of you for joining us. And there'll be an announcement of another talk in this series in 2 weeks. Well, the announcement will come, the talk will be in 2 weeks. So thank you, everyone. And Arturo, I guess you'll put us all into, for those of you who want to stay, we'll be put into breakout rooms.
Thanks, Jennifer. So just so everybody remembers, if you're staying for the breakout session, it will not be recorded. So I'm going to end the recording now, and you will get a prompt to go into your breakout room via the Zoom window. So look for that, and I'll open those in just a second.